This next segment we're doing as a joint team because we talked about, warfighting, the readiness for warfighting, people, the readiness of people. We've had a lot of discussions about family readiness. We realized that, in the act of warfighting, that sometimes things don't go as planned because the enemy gets a vote. And in that, we talk about stressors and about leadership. And I'll tell you, you've seen at least the uniform personnel have seen the thing where on the We Are Naval Aviation, we talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, before us are two giants, Jack and Cathy Ensch. Jack was commissioned in 1965. F4, Phantom, Rio, 4 Vietnam deployments, 285 combat missions, 2 MiG-17 kills. He's a warrior. He's also a POW. And he and his wife, Cathy, are going to talk to us about that experience and what that experience meant to their family and how they led through that experience. Following that, we realized that our combat expectations weren't what they needed, and so we stood up this school called Top Gun. Well, Jack Ensch, after his release from captivity, was one of the first XOs of that school, went on to be CO of Key West, came back here to San Diego through NTC San Diego, and then retired 30 years after his commission in 1995. And then had, I think, probably the coolest job anybody could have. He was the San Diego Padres military liaison representative. But what that got he and Cathy into is just being proponents for military families and just doing a phenomenal job, obviously, in service, beyond their time in service. And I don't want to steal any thunder for them, but I do want to let's give them a warm welcome, and I think you're going to find this a very enjoyable and educational experience. So.
Well, as a Padre, I don't know if that's a compliment to be calling a giant or not. But thank you, Admiral, for the kind words, and we appreciate that. We call our little presentation One Family's POW Experience. We were one of 600 or so that went through, some more so than myself and our experience, because I was a late shoot down. I was just there the last 7 months of the war. I got me on my 4th cruise, and I'd been shot down on my 1st cruise. I'd been there since 1966. That would have been 7 years. So I'd trade 7 months for 7 years any day, unless it's in a flying billet. But so we're going to we've patterned our brief after 2 of our heroes, Jim and Civil Stockdale. And I don't have to tell this crowd who Jim and Civil Stockdale are. They are icons as far as American patriots. But they had a book, they wrote a book years ago, it's called In Love and War. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And the way the book was constructed is 1 chapter or 2 would be telling, Jim would be saying what was happening to him in the POW camp, and halfway around the world, and the next chapters or something, and Sybil would be talking about what was happening to her and the boys here at that same time, and it kind of went back and forth like that. So, we just blatantly stole that idea from the Stockdales. But so that's the way we're going to present this. We'll talk about a little bit what was happening to me, and then back to her and back and forth. You need a clicker? Okay. Yes, dear. 54 years, I know. And so Cathy and I are both Midwestern products, born and raised in Illinois, me in Springfield, her up near Peoria. We met at college at Illinois State University. It was called Illinois State Normal University. She graduated 6 months before I did because I was in stupid study. No, I put myself through college, so I laid out and worked for a while and got money to finish my last semester. And during that time, Illinois State Normal University were going through a process, and they were dropping the normal. And so she graduated with a degree that said Illinois State Normal University. And the next year when I graduated, they had changed the name and it became Illinois State University. And she contends that they had to drop the normal in order to get me a present, a diploma. So that's her story. She sticks with it all the time. Anyway, after graduation, went through Pensacola AOCS program through the Rio training out to 121, and then first of my cruises was on USS Coral Sea in '66, and then Ranger. Then the one we're going to talk about is the fourth one. I won't agonize you with all four of them, trust me. The 72 cruise on Midway was a little bit different than the other three. We were used to deployments because we'd been through three of them, but this one, it was March of 1972, and we were still 7 weeks away from deployment date when the North invaded South Vietnam in the Big Tet event. As a matter of fact, we were right out here getting ready for our ORE and all that stuff. And the captain came up on one MC and he says, "We're returning to Alameda." He says, "You will have 72 hours to get home to your bases, pack your bags, get back here, and we're off." So we didn't even finish training. We went. So a few weeks after that, transit, we were flying combat missions again over Vietnam. So I left Cathy and the girls here in a place like this, and then all of you out there wearing flight suits, you recognize what that is. That's your home at sea. So I traded that for the we got over there, and we started working up, flying some missions, break-in missions down to South Vietnam, and then finally we moved north and started flying missions up north. And in May of 1973, or 72, my pilot and I, God rest his soul, Muggs McEwen and I have been flying together as a crew for 2 cruises, and we got the ultimate of what a fighter pilot can hope for, is to test your mettle for real. After hundreds and hundreds of ACM practices against adversaries and everything like that, you know, it's kind of like baseball, hitting balls off Iron Mike, the pitching machine, you know, and then finally getting into a real ball game. And so we were on a MidCat mission, and we went up north, placed ourselves between Capt and Hanoi, or Haiphong, where the strike was going in. And as soon as we crossed the beach, our controller out on Red Crown said, "We have bandits, your vector 270, 35 miles, something like that." And so we started taking off. And as we were going, Muggs said, "Did he say bandits?" I said, "Yeah, I think that's what I heard," because the term that, you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir, but in bandit, that meant that is an enemy airplane. Otherwise, they were called a bogey, and you had to identify them before you could shoot, and all the rules of engagement and all that stuff that we had to live with. But so I called back and said, "Did you say bandit?" Red Crown says, "Yes, bandits confirmed. You are cleared to fire." Holy crap. So off we go. We're filing his vectors, going on in there. And I'm working the radar, and then our wingman comes up and says, "Hey, my radar just went Tango uniform." So we had 1 radar, 2 airplanes going in there, and I'm looking. Finally, I got a couple of paints, but the F4B, that's what we had, F4Bs. The F4B radar over land was terrible with all the clutter and ground clutter and everything. And I did get a couple of paints, but I couldn't lock up. By about that time, Muggs says, "Tally-ho on the nose, 7 miles," something like that. And what he had spotted was 2 MiG-19s coming through. And tally-ho, we came through, and they went between us. Muggs says, okay, cross turn, we'll go high, you go low. And Mike Rabb and Ken Crandall, they went low, we went high. Well, what we didn't know was that the MiG-19s were the bait. And there were 4 MiG-17s in trail of them in formation coming up against us. Their game plan was for us to turn into after the 19s, and then the MiG-17s would be at R6. Luckily, they had not left enough nose-to-tail separation between the two elements, and instead of breaking in between them, we broke right into the formation of the MiG-17s, 4 of them. And that's where the excrement hit the air conditioning system. And so we turned on them, and it was a big fur ball. And we were the MiG-19s we were turning with some 17s, and the MiG-19s made a pass back through the fight. And Muggs got a bead on one of them, and he tried to turn on them. At this time, of course, I'm out of the cockpit. I'm looking behind, and I see a MiG-17 at our 8 o'clock. I said, Muggs, 8 o'clock, tracking and shooting. Do some of that pilot stuff up there. And so he looked back, and in the violent maneuvers of trying to break his tracking solution like that, we actually departed. He departed the airplane. I didn't do it. Heard the airplane, and it went actually nose over tail one time, and then he finally recovered it, MiG in front of us. We took a shot at it. We missed. We did a couple more. We got engaged with a couple more 17s, and we took another shot. We missed, and we're thinking, oh my God, what a failure we are. About this time, I see another one at 4 o'clock, and I say, oh, Muggs, 4 o'clock, tracking and shooting. And a MiG-30, so Muggs turned into him to break the tracking solution. And we did that. The MiG-17 pilot pulled way up like this. He could see over the nose. Well, Muggs had been part of the program Have Drill, Have Donut, where he had actually flown MiG-17 in that program. So he realized immediately that pilot cannot see over that big bulbous nose. He can't see us. So I think what the guy was doing was he knew he could turn inside our turn. So he was just pulling like that and waiting for us to appear getting the other shot. Muggs immediately recognized that. Training. Without hesitation. He came out of burner, went full forward, negative G, and we just built separation. As this guy went on around like this, we pulled in behind him, and we got a shot and shot him down. About this time, we looked across a circle, and this whole time we had been fighting up above. MiG-17s were tracking Rookie and Crandall at treetop level, they didn't have a chance. They just couldn't get any traction at all. And we saw what was going on down there. Muggs called him, says, drag him this way. We rolled in behind that, shot him off of his tail. That was our second kill that day. Looked around and realized that, hey, it's time to get out of Dodge. So we took off, came back, went back to the ship. This is us in Ready 6 on Midway after we had come back, celebration, and trying to tell all the guys in the squadron, what superheroes, what giants we were. And anyway, that was a great day. And so we were celebrating on the Midway, and Cathy and Laurie, his wife, got a message back here that we had done that, and so they were celebrating here too. And I think out on a shopping spree buying new clothes and no, I take it back. That was a cheap shot. Anyway, so that was that. The real 3 months later, though, that was what I call the thrill of victory. 3 months later, I suffered what they called the Agony of Defeat. Remember the old ABC show that called it that? Muggs got orders back out, and he became the first commanding officer when they stood up Top Gun as a separate squadron. And I picked up another pilot, Mike Doyle, and Mike and I were flying then. And ironically, we were flying in the same airplane that Muggs and I got the MiGs in. And ironically, Mike and I were on our 13th combat mission together. I'm not superstitious, but we had another MIG-Cap mission. We went across the beach and immediately got taken under fire by a number of surface-to-air missile batteries. We were able to successfully defeat some of them. And I remember had my hand up in the handhold against the G's and operating the equipment down here, the ECM gear and chaff, and looking back and watching one go behind us. And all of a sudden, just a huge explosion. Next thing I know, I'm sitting in the backseat of the Phantom with my hand down here, bleeding all over myself, shrapnel and charge of the canopy laying all over the place, throughout my body too. And it's always the one you don't see, went off right over our canopies. I remember vividly saying, "Mike, can we get to the water?" Because we were probably only 10, 15 miles inland by that time, and going to our station. He didn't answer. I looked up forward, and I saw Mike was not flying that airplane. He was kind of slumped forward. We were 400 and some knots, and about a 30 degrees nose down, and about 3,000 or 4,000 feet above the the ground. So, discretion, the better part of valor. I reached down with my good hand, ejected us both from the airplane. The good hand, this one, you'll see I like to say I came back to the war a little short-handed. But next thing I remember was hanging in the chute and looking around, trying to put our training together. Okay, what's my area here? And I reached for my survival radios to make a call to our wingman and say, "Hey, I'm alive," because that was important. Let them know you're alive. And I realized that the computer, or the hands weren't doing what the computer was telling it to do. And I looked down, because I carried my radios up here in my survival vest. And I looked down, and the force of the ejection and hitting the wind stream and like that had dislocated both elbows, pushed them about halfway up under each armpit, and then partially severed that thumb. And so I couldn't make a radio call. And then my next concern was these strange noises I heard coming around me. And I looked down and I realized that those were bullets. They were shooting at me in the chute coming down. So I didn't have an arm to bless myself, but I thought, well, I'm in your hands, God. Luckily, I wasn't in the air very long because it was a low altitude, or else they were not very good shots, or both. I didn't get shot. I landed in a rice paddy. This is simulating the way I was. That's not me, but I fought my head up out from underneath the water and propped it up against one of the walkways, and they continued to shoot and it hit the water around me for a few shots. And finally, they slashed through the rice paddy and pulled me out, took me to dry land, stripped me down, everything down to my undershorts and my T-shirt. While they were waiting for darkness to transport me, a kind young Vietnamese girl came over and she took my mangled thumb, tucked it into the palm of my hand, and wrapped it round and around with gauze to keep it from flopping around and helpfully stop the bleeding some. After dark, they took me down to a main road, and they turned me over to the militia. I mean, these were the local militia. They turned me over to the uniformed, threw me in the back of a truck, and transported me to Hanoi. And this is where I ended up at the Maison Centrale, which is Wallow Prison, which we called Hanoi Hilton. And the service was terrible. The main you got everything. The main gate, the only gate, is right up here. And I was taken and put into a room in this building here somewhere. It was about a 10 by 12 foot room, something like that. It had a table, a chair, a stool, and a waste can over in the corner. Took me in there, threw me on the floor, locked the door, and left. So I'm left there for a few hours just contemplating my what was going to happen to me. Pretty soon, the door opens. Interrogator comes in, sits in the chair with his interrogation book on the table. Guy puts a stool in front of it like that, and they grab me by my arms, and the guards make me sit on a stool in front of him, and we start the quiz, you know, and something I had not really studied well for. And so anyway, name, rank, number, date of birth. Then he started asking me military questions, you know, what kind of weapons, what this and that, and what squadron are you from, and what ship are you from. Hell, they knew all that stuff anyway. But anyway, I told him I couldn't do it, couldn't tell him anything else. But so this went on for 10, 15 minutes maybe, and the interrogator got up, closed his book, walked out. Guards come over onto the floor again. Okay, it goes on for another maybe an hour or so. They come back in. We go through the routine again. Can't tell you more than that. Okay, boom, back on the floor. This went on for the next 3.5 days around the clock. They come in every few hours, go through the same routine. I didn't say anything. They kick me back on the floor, and then they leave. In the meantime, I had a lot of time to think. And I'm looking, and my arms are starting to discolor from lack of circulation. I had no idea what was under that bloody bandage on my arm, on my hand. And during this time, I kept asking them for please, I need medical attention. And one of the interrogators, it wasn't always the same interrogator. I mean, I was on duty the whole time. They took watches. And so one of them had said, no, we won't give you medical attention until you start cooperating. That was their big word with them, cooperate. Something our Congress could learn, I guess. But he said, unless you cooperate, we will not give you medical attention. And then he made something that really got my attention. He says, you know you're dying. He said, we will just let you die unless you cooperate. And after that session, I started thinking, holy moly. So, you know, I got to thinking, I thought about Cathy and my third girls back home, and, you know, this and that, and the code of conduct. I knew what the code of conduct was. I was trying to adhere to it, blah, blah, blah. So I finally rationalized in my mind, okay, here's my game plan. Next time they come in, I'm going to start answering some of these questions to see what happens. I'll tell them lies, or I'll tell them, you know, what ship are you from? Well, hell, you know, aviators, we wear it all over us. Okay, you're a carrier, one. You know, they had my flight suit and all that stuff. USS Midway, the F-161, all that crap. They knew where I was from. But it was just a matter that they wanted to let you know that they could make you do it. So, but when it came to military, anything I thought was of military value, I just lied. That seemed to work, because after that session, a few hours later, they came in, blindfolded me, and transported me out of the prison to a medical facility someplace. Probably the same one John McCain was in, I guess, because I don't know what else. Took me into an operating room, strapped me down to a table with straps on my ankles, across my thighs and upper body, torso. And then 2 or 3 physician's assistants, I'll call them, came in and held my head and my shoulders in place. And the doctor came in and unwrapped what was the bloody gauze in the hand like that, pulled my arm over the side like that, and amputated my thumb. No anesthetic, no nothing, no mother may I, how do you feel in bud, or very terrible bedside manner. But after that, and they got that taken care of, unstrapped me, and they took me into another room, and they took what they call a fluoroscope. It's kind of a precursor of x-rays, I guess, of the 2 elbows, and they looked at them, and they sat me down in a chair against the wall, and the same assistants came over and held me in place, and the doctor came over and grabbed my arms, put his foot in my chest, and started pulling on them until they popped back out. Wrapped them up in a couple of rudimentary splints, blindfolded me, and took me back to the prison. And so after that, I was in a room for the next, sorry, to make sure I don't, went back in there, and then I was in a room isolated for the next 30 days until finally they caught me communicating with some other prisoners And then I was put in with those group of prisoners. Meanwhile, oh, I have a clicker. We need 2 clickers. You can see that this is not professionally done.
Make sure, am I on? Oh, good. Meanwhile, I was back in San Diego with our girls, and I have a couple of things I would use to describe myself. First of all, I'm a mom, and now a grandma, and I see you smiling. You know that's a really important job. I'm also a Navy wife, and I'm very, very proud to be a Navy wife. I think we're a really classy group, don't you? We had a very important job to keep home going while the husbands were gone, and you're continuing to do that today. So that's it. I really feel strongly about that job. And my third job, I am a teacher. So I really like our being able to tell the story. So we were in San Diego, and here are my 3 girls at the time. They were 1, 3, and 7. And as you can imagine, I was pretty busy. And Jack explained that this was our 4th cruise. So we were used to Dad not being home, and we had our routine, and we would go about, kids had to be fed and in school and that whole thing. And so I was grateful to have that. But in any case, it was a really wonderful experience. When the black car drove up and parked in front of my house, I knew immediately what was going on. And I need to, first of all, sort of set the climate at the time, because the war was very, very, people hated the war. They were very, very war weary. Too many people had died. The war had gone on too long, and lots of people were protesting in the streets. There was some even violence kind of going on. And so as a Navy family, we kept a very low profile. We didn't talk about what Dad was doing. And it was a climate that we didn't even have very much information available to us. We pretty much depended upon Walter Cronkite at the 6:30 News. And we found out since then that some of that information was manipulated. The American public were not told everything that they should have been told about what was going on, but that was what we had going for us, and that's what we had to use. So when the black car drove up in front, I knew exactly what was going on, and it was occupied by the commanding officer of the naval base, NAS North Miramar. It was a naval base at the time, and he was a friend of ours. There was a CACO officer, there was a chaplain, and then the XO's wife, because the CO's wife was out of town, so she got to come and see me. And they told me as much as they could tell me. They had seen 2 shoots. They did not know if Jack was dead or alive, so his status was missing in action. And he stayed missing in action for the next 3 or 4 months. So I did what I could do. As I said, I had the 3 girls to keep me busy, and I was happy about that. But in the same case, one day I would say, oh, I'm never going to see him again. What am I going to do with my life? And then the next hour I would say, no, he's going to make it. I know he's going to make it. And that vacillating back and forth was driving me crazy. So I decided, and I'm a German girl, really practical, and I said, and as far as I'm concerned, Jack is alive until the Navy tells me he's dead. And then I will continue, deal with it at that time. So I continued doing what I had been doing, and it was what Jack would have wanted me to do. So the girls and I continued carrying on our life just as we had. So let me check. So there's a great deal of support. I mentioned that CACO officer. The Navy did provide a casualty assistance officer to all of the spouses that were in the situation that I was in. And he was wonderful. He was the liaison between the military and myself, kept me informed of whatever it can do. The first morning after Jack was shot down, he and I were at the bank when it opened, and we took all of our funds out of the joint accounts and put them into my name, so that had they found out that Jack was missing in action, those funds would have been frozen. At the time, that was what they did. So he knew what to do, and he really took care of me in lots of other little ways, too, as far as finances and that kind of thing. And he got Social Security cards for the girls, little things like that. But he was a wonderful friend and stayed with me the whole time. I also had support from the Navy wives, and you wives here know what a wonderful support that is. Those ladies they're my sisters, and even to this day, I'm closer to most of them than I ever was to my biological sister, because she had not a clue of what my life was like, and the Navy wives did. So I was continued to be involved in the Navy, the squadron functions while the men were deployed. But once they came home, it became a little awkward because Jack wasn't there. So I then also was welcomed by the POW wives, and that group was an elite group, and there were quite a few here in San Diego because of Miramar and all the flying going on. There were a lot of POW wives here. They'd been there and done that. They knew how to buy houses and sell cars without power of attorney. They knew how to get things done, and they were so helpful, and they immediately welcomed me into their group. So there was a lot of support there, Navy-wise. There was also public support, and the people in the United States were very unhappy about the war, and this was at least one thing they could be concerned about. And the Navy wives, the POW wives, Civil Stockdale, Phyllis Galante, Shirley Stark, several of them, they began to make noise because they weren't getting any information whatsoever. We had been told by the Navy, just go back home, be quiet, don't make a fuss, don't talk to the press. So these gals decided that was a bunch of baloney, and they were going to make some noise. And so they began to ask questions. They went to the embassies. They went to the Vietnamese embassy and began to demand questions and ask questions about their husbands and what their conditions were, how they were being treated. Some of them were actually being able to send letters home, and from those letters they could tell that they were not being treated well. So these ladies made a stink, and when they did, the American public became aware of what was going on. And the Vietnamese were very much aware of public opinion, and they used it as best they could. Well, in this case, the American people stood up, and they began to buy bracelets. Now, these bracelets are precursors to those pink ones that we wear for breast cancer, and the red ones for prostate cancer, those kinds of things. So these were bracelets that people could, and I think it was the POW families and they actually organized it. And you know, for $10 you could send in, and you could get a name at random, or if you could request a name if it was someone that you knew. And then your job was to pray for that person, support that person, and psychologically and the whole thing. But what it did was it sort of rallied the American public. It gave them something they could do for this frustrating war that they were involved in. It gave them an actual tangible thing that they could do. And it was amazing results, amazing. In the 9 months that Jack was gone, at the end of the war, the government asked the people to send their bracelets back. And Jack and I received 600 bracelets just in that 9 months. So that gives you an idea of how many people were involved in this. It really was. And the upshot of it is, I think that if it had not been for those women and making the public aware of what was going on, I'm not so sure the POWs would have been home. I'm not sure they would have been a bargaining chip in that peace agreement. So they are my heroes as far as I'm concerned. So you can see that there was a great deal of support for me. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Jack, and he'll tell you about what a day in the camp was like.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I said that I was in a little hut in the central part of the, we called it Camp Unity, one part of, go back to that, yeah. Well, that's just that's a two-man cell in, this was Heartbreak Hotel. I was never in there, but it gives you kind of an idea of what the accommodations were. Go back to the regular, the big picture of the next one. Okay. At the time, I was, there we go. Like I said, I was in this area here when I was first questioned. Then they took me out, and I came back in here for about another 10 days or so. And then they moved me into this area. This right here was kind of a makeshift shower, and they had a quiz room constructed right next to it with bamboo huts and everything like that. And I was in here. And what they caught me doing was these are big long cells. These will handle 25, 30, 40. All these are big long cells, which is depicted here in Okay, this is from the Hanoi Hilton Museum now, which is there, and but you see they were just big long cells like that, and you could with concrete abutments on where you slept on either side and a walkway in between. They caught me communicating with guys in cell 7 through a break in a fence that they had constructed there. And once that happened, it was almost like, well, his, any exploitation of him is gone because he's been contaminated now by the rest of the POWs, so he's probably got the word about how to resist or something like that. So after that, a few hours after they got me communicating, I was put into a room with 25 other guys in room 5, many of whom I know, and some of them were from Midway. We had a regular Midway dead up there, for crying out loud. And so I got into there, and the guys, they kind of nursed me back to health and got me moving again. And so the daily routine was, you get up in the morning, and they would open the gates, the cell doors, and let you out for a little while to get your food and bring it back in, and then lock you up until midday. Then you'd come out again, and you'd get your next ration, which was meager, and then lock you up in the rest of the afternoon, and then the evening again. What you didn't have for lunch, you had leftovers for dinner. And so this was kind of, the routine was very boring. I mean, of course, the bombing was going on all around us. We could hear the war going on around us, but we were out of the picture there. Our job then was to resist and to try to thwart them in any way we could to keep them from getting any propaganda stuff out of us like that. This is a picture of the TAP code. In the POW situation, communication was paramount, and we had to have a way of communicating. And Admiral Stockdale and Denton and all the higher-ups, they were isolated away from us. The Vietnamese separated the very senior officers away from us because they tried to disrupt our military posture, which they didn't do. We kept a military posture the whole time. And every cell, the most senior guy there, he was called the SRO, Senior Resident Officer, and he was in charge of that cell. If somebody came in later, shot down, came in and said, "Okay, what's your date and rank?" "Okay, well, I'm the SRO," and bullet gets shot down, and he comes in, he's in my cell like that. "What's your date and rank?" "Guess what? You're now the SRO," and that's the way he worked it. And the information came down from the isolation area where the leaders were kept, which we called Sky. Information came down from the sky. And the way we passed that information, one of them was the TAP code. And it was, very simple. One of Smitty, one of the early POWs, learned this somewhere in Air Force Series School, I think he said. He heard about it or something. He came in, he started pressing. What you do is you make a matrix like this, you throw the K out because the C makes the same sound, so that way you get 5 and 5, and if you want to tap something, you go, okay, I want to say B, I'd go tap 1, and then tap tap, column, row, row, column, and so that's the way you would do it. And some of these guys who'd been there a long time, I mean, they got almost like telegraph guys back in the day where they, the little telegraph thing and click, 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 dot, dash, and they could just spit this stuff out. And if you knew what the next word was, you just tap on the wall like that, the guy'd stop it and he'd go to the next word. So, and that's how the messages went on the TAP code. You could use it either tapping on walls, or if you were out in a courtyard or something like that, and guys in this cell over here, and I was over here, I could go, sweep, 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 and they could, so it was a tap code that way. We also had a flash code, which was kind of a version of the American Sign Language, where if you weren't in audible distance from like that, across the room like that, you could go A, B, C, and flash code like that. So the communication is just, and during siesta time up there, one guy, one of the POWs, I forgot who it said, he said, sometimes he said it sounded like a colony of woodpeckers going on around, because they would take their siesta, and then that was a good time to communicate. You'd have a lookout making sure nobody was there, and then tapping on pipes and walls and everything like that. And it was just peck, 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 peck. Anyway, that was the lifeblood. So our daily routine just went along. Occasionally they would pull guys out for quizzes, but the treatment was the really heavy torture and everything had gone away by that time, except in individual cases like mine and some of the B-52 guys when they got shot down. Their electronic communications officers, they pulled out of them, and they really leaned hard on them too, because trying to get some information like that. So, but the B-52s in December, well, the peace talks started going on they started, I think, September, October that year, over in Paris, and then they fell apart, and the Vietnamese walked away from the table, I guess. And so in December, Nixon sent in the B-52s, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff had told Johnson when the war first started that's what they should do. Well, finally they took some military advice. B-52s came in and started bombing all the industrial area up in Hanoi. And it was just 4th of July and New Year's Eve and everything all going on at once. I mean, just the bombing and everything. That brought him back to the table, and finally the peace agreement was signed in January 1973. So that part of that agreement concerning our POWs, I'm sorry, Proton, I'm standing in front of you there, was that the POWs would be released by shoot-down date with the first in, first out. And so when that happened, I was still in the Hanoi Hilton, and one night we heard the trucks coming down, bringing guys, the old-timers, the Fogs, down from camp up near China, and they started sorting us out by shoot-down date. And Hanoi Hilton was going to be the main release point for all the long-time guys. So they moved us over into an area called the Zoo, another prison in the Hanoi area, and that's where I was released from. And so they loaded us in trucks, took us over there, and starting in February then, they started releasing our POWs. Ev Alvarez and the early guys on first, and I was in the last group of POWs to be released in 29th of March 1973, because I was a late shoot down. But this is actually my room in the zoo, and this was a few days before we were to be released. And of course, anytime they brought photographers around, we were always instructed, turn your back, don't give them any propaganda, stuff like that. So this is Mike Penn and Ted Treble, myself, and that's me peeking over the shoulder there to tell the guys, okay, they're gone, so we can turn around and get back with our life. You can see this is, you're pointing at it, that was what my arm was at the time. But these are the accommodations. I think you could get queen size or king size, but there was no room service at all. Anyway, so finally, I had not been allowed to write a letter the whole time. So before we were released, they went through and they picked out all the POWs who had never been allowed to write a letter home throughout the whole 10 years. They pulled them out and they said, here, you write a letter home. What do we call that in the Navy when they have an inspection? You gun deck it? Oh, yeah. What do you mean? Everybody got to write a letter home. You can't accuse us of that. So I got to write a letter home. And of course, they didn't mail it, but One of the early POWs somehow saw this letter laying there as they were getting, and he spirited it out of there and brought it home and gave it to Cathy. She had special delivery of this letter, no stamps or anything, but this was the only letter I got to send to her. Finally, it was our time to come home. They fitted us out with our get out of jail clothes, and loaded us up in buses and took us out to Geelong Airport there in Hanoi. And next slide. And this is me being repatriated. I can't remember the colonel's name, Air Force Colonel. I'll just call him Shorty. No offense, Bullet. And they had the Vietnamese and Americans both had tables, and they had our list of name, and they would call you forward. You would step forward. They call your name out, Lieutenant John Ensch, and they'd mark it off of each list, make sure that I was who I said I was, and then you would march out, and there was an officer greeting you home, and then they took us loaded us on the C-141s, and took us to fly out. This is a picture. This is the last group of POWs leaving Hanoi in a C-141. I'm back in there somewhere. There's Rudloff and Rudy and Bill Ellender. Anyway, I'm back in the crowd there somewhere. And this is kind of, I don't want to say that. This was not taken right as we got on the airplane, because there were starts and stops of whether we were going to go home or weren't, you know. So it's hard. You get your hopes up, and Cathy was talking about, you know, is he dead? Is he alive? The same thing. Are we going home or we're not going home? So we get on that emotional roller coaster. So we got on the 141, and we started rolling down the runway, and we were sitting there just stoic, just everybody saying, you know, no shit, is this really going to happen? And this picture was snapped just as we crossed the coast of North Vietnam. Pilot came up on the I don't know what the Air Force calls it, the 1MC, and said, gentlemen, we have just crossed the coastline to North Vietnam. We are over international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin, heading our way to Clark. And boom, that's what happened right there. So that was a great day. Went to Clark Air Force Base. We spent a couple of days there, depending upon your condition. They took care of any immediate medical attention that you needed right away, and some guys had to have teeth pulled and, you know, and things like that. And they checked my arm out and fitted me up with some kind of a device to straighten the wrist out again. And then we were put on a C-141 out of Clark, flew to Hawaii, refueled, and then came home. Flew into Travis, and waiting there were C-9s waiting to take us to our various bases. And so the next thing was I ended up, what's this? And yeah. In the meantime, while I'm going through all that, she's getting ready for my return.
I want to go back to the letter. I didn't receive any mail whatsoever from Jack the whole time he was gone. And the Navy had, my CACO had advised me that we could send a package. And of course, the package had all these restrictions on how size and what could have in it, and what it couldn't have in it. And so I followed all the rules and filled out the list, filled out the box, gave it to the CACO, and he mailed it. And about a month later, my little 4-year-old came running in the front door, and she said, "We got a package from Daddy. We got a package from Daddy." Of course, that was like routine, right? And I looked at the package, and it was my package that I had sent. And it was stamped deceased on it. Now, who's got a stamp that says deceased? I did not understand that. But in any case, I did not receive anything from Jack until I got this letter that was brought out excuse me, by one of the early releases. And it was wonderful to see his handwriting. And he expressed in it his concern about his well-being because he wasn't sure he was ever going to fly again. And, of course, that was paramount. So they brought all the POW wives out to Miramar. And there's a huge theater there. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but the stage is up here, and the seats are down here. So the brass, the heavy, the admirals, and everyone were up on the psychologists were all up on the stage, and we were down in the seats. And they proceeded to tell us that our husbands were going to be vegetables, to be prepared for the very worst. And here we were, all just beyond over the moon.
I wanted to be a rutabaga.
We were all so excited, and then to be brought down like that, we really were devastated. But the basis for their saying that was the fact that they had used data collected from POWs from the World War II, from Korea, and there was a big difference between those POWs and their experiences, as well as from the Vietnam POWs. First difference was that most of the POWs from Vietnam had been to college. They were educated, and they had maintained that military structure, which had psychologically supported them all the way through. They supported one another. They had an environment that they could deal in, and they could cope. And that was the difference, I think. It was a huge, everyone was more or less surprised when they saw the condition of the POWs. Those that had been there for 5 and 6 years were amazing, just amazing. So we managed to get through this being prepared. So you can see this is the girls and I, and Jack's mother was there as well, and we met him at Miramar when he flew in, and as he said, he was in the last group, and I know that everyone that was an adult at the time knows exactly where they were when that first plane landed and those POWs got off. It was quite an experience, the same as the landing on the moon. So in any case, we celebrated, and Jack came home, and you can see that we were really happy to have him home. And I told you before how the public didn't think much of the war, but they were very happy about the POWs coming home. This was one positive thing that we could celebrate out of that war. And so my neighbor, who hadn't always been positive, put up this huge sign on our garage door to welcome Jack home. And if you have a chance, it is on display at the Air and Space Museum in Pensacola. We were stationed there and I was a docent in the museum, and they were trying to put together this POW exhibit. And I said, well, I got a bunch of stuff in my garage, in my closet. I'd be happy to. So I got rid of all those boxes that I'd been toting around. But I also allowed my girls to go through and take out what they wanted. We kept a few things for ourselves. But most of that stuff that's there are bracelets there, there are letters that my daughters wrote. And I mean, it really is a wonderful exhibit. So that's why Lieutenant Ensch is a part of it. So. Mm-hmm. So this is our girls. This was a picture that was taken when Jack returned. Nice hairstyle. And the little girl is the largest one, the oldest one, was 7 at the time. She's now 53. So that just gives you an idea of the time that we're talking about here. But what happened was the Navy, the military, asked people to send those bracelets back. And so they provided us with a photo. It's in the bag. There's a photo, and it was half of it was white, and so we could write a message on it. So we returned a letter of thank you to all those people who had worn Jack's bracelet. It was a way, it just sort of renews your faith in American spirit, right? I mean, I just really felt very strongly about it. So we managed to write 600 of those letters to thank those people. And even to this day, we still sometimes get them. About a couple years ago, Jack was at the Padres, and a lady in Washington had gone through her mother's attic when her mother passed away, and there was Jack's bracelet. So she Googled him and found out that he worked for the San Diego Padres. So the Padres connected with her. She contacted them and asked about him.
You can't hide these days.
And so we surprised him on the field, and he was presented with this bracelet. This lady came from Washington and presented Jack with this bracelet, and that was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So that was a wonderful thing that went on at the time. What else do I have to say?
There's your water.
Oh, okay, I think I'm done. Understand is how important the Navy family is, and that maintaining that rock, that even though the children are moved from one place to another, that home unit stays the same, and they're the rock that you keep together. So we look at one another today and count our blessings, because we have a great deal to be grateful for. So.
Well, I got back to hospital. I spent 9 months in physical therapy and other operational type things there at Balboa, put me back together. And as I told Bullitt earlier, I convinced the Navy that I could still operate everything I needed to operate in the backseat of a Phantom and later an F-14. And if I had been a pilot, I'd been screwed because I couldn't have put the speed brakes on. But as a Rio, they let me back into flight status and went out and became the XO Top Gun for 2.5 years, and then transitioned into F-14s. Had my own F-14 squadron, the F-114, the Fighting Aardvarks, which, like every other squadron, airplane, and ship I always served in, is now almost in the boneyard like me. And from there I went on, and we had a successful and wonderful Navy adventure career. And so it's, you know, this, the sea story here, okay, what's the moral? Is that naval aviation, all services, I guess, but I'm saying naval aviation because that's what we know, is it's not just the person who is serving. Naval aviation is a family affair. And without the family supporting those who are going out there and sit on the tip of the spear, where you don't have to worry about, what's happening at home, if everything is being taken care of like that, so you can concentrate on your job. So that's the way I look at it, as a family affair. The family is just as much involved in your career as you think you are. I say you think you are, I mean you are. So that's important a thing to me. And like I say, we call it one family's experience of POW. You never know what's going to happen, and you got to be ready for it. And this, to me, really reinforced that personally for my my incarceration time. And it was without the family support, you can't do your job as well as you should be doing.
You forgot about forgiveness.
Do I?
Forgiveness.
Oh, yeah. Well, forgiveness. Yeah. Oftentimes I get asked, you must hate those bastards, for what they did to you and everything like that. Well, I'll admit that when I first got back, I had a little bit of animosity for the way I was treated, but you got to thinking about it, and I finally, one of the POWs some years later, Porter Halliburton, another F4 Rio. They're smart guys. And I was at a function where he was talking, and he was a good South Carolina boy, Southern Baptist, and raised to, gave himself to Christ and the whole thing, And he said, and he was there for, I think he was there for 5.5, almost 6 years. And Porter said, I guess somebody asked him that question, and I was in the audience hearing that. And Porter said, he says, no. He said, when I got released, he says, I got out, before I got on the bus, he says, I turned around and I looked at the Hanoi Hilton and I said, I forgive you. Turned around and walked off and said, go. And I thought, when I heard him say that, because I was already getting, a number of years after it happened, and when I first got back, I didn't think I was ever going to fly again. I guess that was what I was pissed off about. Those bastards who took the flying away from me, but that wouldn't happen. Anyway, I got to thinking about it, and I said, that's kind of the way I think about it too, because the smallest prison cell in the world, if you let it be, is right here between your ears, right up here. If you continue to hold hate and all that stuff up there, they're half a world away. They don't know what the hell that you hate them, or that So all you're doing is hurting yourself. So that's the way I've kind of looked at it too. It was a part of my life. It wasn't the end of my life. And of course, I was born and raised a Catholic boy, altar boy, and all that stuff. And so what's the Lord's Prayer say? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So I always say, well, if it was good enough for Jesus, if it's good enough for Jesus, it's probably good enough for Jack Inch. So that's the kind of attitude I took away from this thing. And it doesn't do any good to sit there and say, oh, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, because you're still prisoner right here. So that's the way I looked at it. Questions?
Can I tell a story?
Sure.
I told you I was a teacher, and I work at the USS Midway Museum. I teach the kids when they come on a field trip, and we have lessons structured around what they're studying. So for the third grade, they're studying communities. Well, we're a floating city. It's real easy. We draw those parallels, and we talk about the fact that in order to have a safe place to live, you need good citizens. And the sailors, we think, were really good citizens because they showed respect, and they cooperated, and they had courage. And then for those characteristics, we take the children around the ship and show them how the sailors would have exhibited those characteristics. So for caring, we go into sick bay and so on. And so for courage, we go into the Chief Petty Officer's mess, and in there is a display for MIAs and POWs. So we talk about the fact that just to be in the military, you take a vow and say, you'll give your life for your country if necessary, and some people do. We talk about the fact, you can imagine I extrapolate on this quite a little bit, but the young children then can see that people do give their lives for their country, and because of them, they're free. And so then we talk about MIAs and POWs, and I say, well, I say, you were flying your airplane off of the Midway, and an enemy shot your plane down. A missile from the surface to the air missile hit your airplane, and you were shot down. And you went into the ocean, and we never saw you again. So you are MIA, missing in action, and we explained that. So now you were flying your airplane off the Midway, and you were hit by a surface-to-air missile, but you were able to eject, and you came down and floated to the ground on a parachute. And the people in the village came out and got you, and they made you stay in that country. They did not let you go home. So do you think you had good treatment? You know, that kind of thing. So we talk about that. And I said, now to make this just a little more interesting, I have a picture of my husband here, and he was a POW. And that's exactly what happened to him. He was flying off of the Midway, and his surface-to-air missile shot him down, and he was captured, and he was made to stay in that country. But we have a good, happy ending to this story, because when the war was over, all those prisoners came home. My husband came back, went back into the Navy. He got back in an airplane and flew again. And this little boy in the front row pops up and says, boy, he didn't learn much, did he? Was there any discussion? I don't remember discussion.
Well, we did. We discussed it.
I just knew that he wanted to fly.
Did.
That's who he was.
That's what I came in for, to serve my country. And you know, actually, I was an English major and a psychology minor and a college wrestler. And I never see 137.5 pounds again, that's for sure. But the way I got started was a bunch of the recruiters in their white uniforms and their gold wings and all that in the student union, and I was getting ready to graduate, and they were talking about, you know, hey, flying in the Navy and this and that and everything. And so my original goal was I was going to graduate. I was going to be a high school teacher and a wrestling coach, and that was, you know, so.
And you had already been in the Army, enlisted.
Yeah, I was. That's something that right out of high school, I was 17 years old when I graduated from high school, and I was let's say my compass was spinning. I didn't have much direction. I was immature, and had I gone to college right away, I'm sure I would have flunked out or whatever. And so I screwed around. Finally, my dad said, "Okay, you're going to do something, and you're not just going to be, you know, hanging around." So, at the time, the Army had a 3-year enlistment. All the rest of them had 4 years. So what? Well, least resistance. Okay, I went in the Army, and I became here's another irony to my life, I guess. Went through Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, basic, and then I got selected to be in artillery. I thought, oh shit, how am I going to fire cannons and, you know, all that stuff like that? Well, artillery is also guided missiles. The guided missile system at the time in the 50s was a Nike Ajax system, which was what really turned into be the SAM-2 system that the Russians stole from us, turned into a SAM and which some years later. Anyway, I went to Fort Bliss, Texas, went through Nike Ajax training, and then I was a plowback, and I became an instructor. And so my whole time was teaching this system. Anyway, I said, okay, Cathy, let's go in the Navy for 4 years, and it'll be fun. I'm going to fly off of carriers for a while, and then we'll get out and we'll go on our education program. And it's like I went in, got flying and everything. I fell in love with it, and I said, hell with this. This is it. I mean, but so that was, so it was, and she agreed with it. She said, but coming back to this, I'm telling you, this is my better three-quarter. People say they have their better half. I got a better three-quarter here. And so, yeah, I struggled to get coming back and going, especially the 9 months there at Balboa. Oh, I'm going through all the, I had a physical therapist there, I forgot her name now. And I told her, I mean, they put you through the, got my arms working again and everything like that. And at one point I told her, Sally was her name, Sally McBride. And I said, hey, Sally, if you ever want to go in another business, I know where I can get you a job. She said, what's that? And I says, Hanoi Hilton is a torturer. But anyway, after I got back, and actually, while I was still in the hospital, Muggs was out at Top Gun, and they got T-38s, had two-seaters. And so he came up and checked me out of the hospital one day. We went out, I put on a flight suit, and I'm still a patient. And we jumped in the back seat of the T-38, and he took off, and we went out in the morning area, and we just flew our ass off, just all kinds of stuff like that. And he says, what do you think? I said, yeah, I want to do this some more. And so we talked about it, and Cathy she liked the Navy life. And it wasn't a big, wasn't a real tough decision to stay in. Right?
Right. No, I loved it. It was a good life. We met wonderful people. We got to see the world. And I was raised in the cornfields of Illinois, so for me it was a real adventure. And I loved the people that we met. And I was telling Chris last night that some of the women that I became the squadron wives with, that were fellow squadron wives with me, they're like sisters to me, and certainly more like my biological sister didn't understand what was going on. So we had a wonderful life, and we even see some of those people now, 40 years later, 20, 30 years later, and it's like we saw them last week. So hang on to those friends. They're really important.
Yeah. You all know what we're talking about there. I mean, it's one big long family of naval aviation. So it wasn't a hard choice, and it was a great adventure as far as I was concerned.
And it ended well. We had a happy ending. We have 5 grandchildren and a wonderful life, and we consider ourselves blessed. We really do.
And we just celebrated 54 years of marriage a week ago, and and I don't regret one day of it. And that day was Thursday, April 4th. Oh no, I get a nickel for that one. Any other questions?
That was very difficult, especially the 7-year-old, the 1-year-old and 4-year-old. They didn't understand time, and Dad had already been gone, so it wasn't an issue. But the 7-year-old, I had a real problem with her. As a teacher, I went to her teacher. She was in the 3rd grade. And at the beginning of the school year, and I explained that my husband's situation. I said, now he's a prisoner of war, not a felon for robbing a bank. And, I didn't want her to be criticized or made fun of in school or whatever. So I made sure that teacher understood what was going on. And in October, I guess, open house, we went to see what the kids were doing in school. And here was her. She was a good student. Here was her workbooks and her papers and stuff, and she hadn't done very little of it had been completed. And on the sides, in the margins, were airplanes crashing, parachutes coming down, and that kind of thing, so she understood. So I spent a little more time after that. I didn't realize how impacted she really was, traumatized. So I did spend some time talking to her, and then I know we explained that he was missing in action until December 23rd. Now, there's a Christmas gift. I got a call from my CACO where his status had been changed. So after that, then it was easy to deal with, but it was not easy at the time. And yeah.
Questions? Yeah, I wanted I talked about Admiral Stockdale, who is, to me is the all-time hero
Another story.
of the POWs. And every POW every time a guy got shot down, they were the source of what was going on, because the Vietnamese, they never let us have any news except Hanoi with their propaganda. But anytime there was a flood or a hurricane or tornadoes, anything like that, they would always tell us about all this terrible stuff that was going on in our country. And so everybody's, they would pick the new guy's brain, hey, who won the World Series, and good, important stuff. And but and there was a big dearth of information from about 68 to 72 because of the bombing halt there, and we weren't going up north, so there weren't that many POWs shot down up there. And so 72, boy, it broke loose, and we started filling up the cells and then information and everything. Well, when I was in that isolation area, I told you right there in the center of the while I was there, it was just a bamboo hut, really, and there were holes in it and everything. And right behind that hut was where they stoked the fire to keep cook food and boil the water that you had to drink, because it was full of vermin and everything. And I was in there, and they had left me a pad of paper and a pen, and I was told that you will write your confession about what a war criminal you are and what you've done, like that, And I say, well, I can't write right now because my arms are. So they left it there. So one day, I had seen there were two Orientals that had the run of the courtyard. Found out later one of them was a South Vietnamese A-1 pilot, Dot, and the other one was a Thai Special Forces sergeant who was shot down with Ernie Brace over in Laos, and then he ended up there. And they were used kind of as slave labor, but they had to run the place. And I saw them peeking, I'd peek out I'd see them moving around. I didn't know who they were. And one day, there was a hole in the back of that hut I was living in, like that. And I'm sitting there, feeling sorry for myself and whatever. And I heard it, psst, psst. I look, and there's this Oriental face peeking in the hole. He said, your name. Give me your name. I get your name out. And I thought, oh, yeah, right. As soon as I turn and talk to you, that door's going to open up, and I'm going to get the crap kicked out of me. No, so I ignored him. And he came back later that day, and then the next day. And in the meantime, I'm thinking, I want my name out, because, you want to be left behind. That was important. So I thought, well, what the hell? What have I got to lose? What are they going to do? Send me to Vietnam? Christ. So I took the pen and I wrote out a note to them. I said, dear Cathy and the girls, I'm okay. I'm a prisoner in Hanoi. I've been injured, but I'm going to be okay. And and I love you very much. And then signed Jack, and then put Lieutenant Jack Ensch, VF 161 Midway, so that when they could know that when it got there. So my reasoning, here you go. I was thinking to myself, it's amazing when you're in solitary that what the hell the mind can do. I thought, well, how the hell did they get these guys would be MIA and then suddenly they'd be a POW? And I thought, I'll bet this guy is a goddamn CIA agent. He's probably living out in Hanoi, because and then he comes in here daily to work, and then, that's probably how it is. So the next time he comes back, and he said, psst, anyway, so I passed it to him. The last I heard of it. So several months advanced. It was the first morning after I got in my hotel, my Balboa room, I'm there in the bed, and this Navy captain comes walking into my room, and and he's walking in, and Stockdale had a terrible knee. He had walked with a limp after his experiences over there. But I recognized who he was, and I started to get out of bed, and he said, no. I said, no, it's okay. Welcome home. Well, yes, sir, Cag. And we called him Cag over there. And he said, Lieutenant Jack Ensch, right? Yes, sir. He says, well, I just want to thank you. And I thought, yes, sir, for what? He says, for giving us one of the biggest laughs we had in the whole time that we were in Hanoi. And I said, what? And he said, you remember the love note that you wrote to your wife and girls that you gave to Chip? That was his call sign, was Chip. John Harneffy was his real name. It was easier to say Chip. And he says, well, what Chip did was they took the food around and over to Sky and where they're isolated, and he slipped that note in with their food, and it was Cag and Robbie Reisner, Denton, Lawrence, Gillespie, anyway, all the heavies. They were in that cell together. And he said, we opened this up and we read your letter. And he says, we started laughing our ass off. And he said, look at this. Here's, because they had, they knew that somebody was in there. They didn't know who I was at the time. But they saw the condition when they brought me in and transported me around. And he said, here's this young Navy lieutenant. He says, beat to hell, all banged up and everything, sitting in the middle of the Hanoi Hilton in downtown Hanoi. And he writes a love letter to his family and thinks the thing's going to get delivered. He said, that was the height of optimism. So I said, well, thanks, Cag. I'm glad I gave you a laugh. So there's, there is some humor in the POW camp, and without humor has played a big part in helping us get through this stuff too. Back and forth, just like in a ready room. You're ragging on the other guy and this and that. So that was a lot of humor that helped us survive the situation as well. So anyway, that's my Cag story. Say goodnight.